The Eastern Front, a battlefield stretching thousands of kilometers, swallowing cities, soldiers, and entire armies in its path. By late 1943, Nazi Germany was no longer the unstoppable war machine it once portrayed itself to be. Its tanks, once feared across Europe, were being destroyed faster than they could be built. The Soviet T-34, simple, brutal, and unstoppable, rolled west like an iron avalanche. As German forces retreated, something became painfully obvious. Infantry, ordinary foot soldiers, were being forced to fight tanks with almost nothing. Rifles couldn't stop a T-34. Grenades barely scratched its armor. Anti-tank guns were too heavy to move, too rare to rely on, and too slow to redeploy. Germany needed a miracle, not a new tank. Those required steel and factories Germany no longer had. What they needed was something so cheap, so simple, that even a factory running on fumes could produce it. And in a small, unremarkable workshop belonging to Haysag, engineers began working on a weapon nobody took seriously at first. A crude, disposable tube that looked more like a plumbing pipe than a battlefield innovation. But within months, this humble device would become the most feared, close-range anti-tank weapon of the war. A weapon that promised to give every soldier, every teenager, every desperate conscript, a chance to destroy a 45-ton steel monster with a single shot. This is the story of how the Panzerfaust became Nazi Germany's last hope, and its deadliest close-range answer to the unstoppable Soviet advance. By 1943, Germany's nightmare was no longer a possibility. It was the daily reality of the Eastern Front. Entire divisions were collapsing under the pressure of Soviet armored offensives. The harsh Russian winter, once an ally against Napoleon, now turned against German forces that were exhausted, outnumbered, and stretched far beyond their limits. On paper, Germany still produced some of the finest tanks in the world: Panthers and Tigers, mechanical beasts with thick armor and powerful guns. In practice, the truth was brutal. They simply couldn't build enough of them. Germany was losing tanks faster than factories could replace them. Soviet production, meanwhile, seemed limitless. The Red Army was fielding thousands of T-34s every month, reliable, rugged, and easy to repair. For the average German infantryman, this imbalance was catastrophic. A rifle, even a machine gun, was useless against a tank. Anti-tank guns were effective but heavy and vulnerable. And new tanks, those required steel, fuel, manpower, and time, resources Germany no longer possessed. Every report sent back to Berlin told the same chilling story. Our infantry is defenseless against enemy armor. And so, a radical idea emerged. If Germany couldn't supply tanks to its infantry, then the infantry needed a weapon that could destroy tanks by themselves. Something lightweight, something cheap, something so simple that a soldier could be trained in minutes. A weapon that even a factory working at half capacity could mass produce. At the industrial giant Haysag, one of Germany's largest armaments manufacturers, engineers were desperate to fill this gap. They studied captured Soviet weapons, they analyzed battlefield data, and they took inspiration from the earlier Faust Patrona, a crude hollow-charge launcher. But what they proposed next was nothing short of revolutionary. A disposable, single-use anti-tank weapon that could be handed to anyone, fired once, and thrown away like a spent cartridge. To many officers, the idea sounded absurd, almost childish. A metal tube with an oversized warhead? A throwaway weapon in the middle of a world war? Yet the engineers insisted this is not a toy. This is the future of infantry warfare. What started as a low-priority experiment soon gained urgency. Reports of Soviet tank breakthroughs were piling up. Entire cities were falling. Berlin demanded results, and it demanded them fast. The fires of the Eastern Front were closing in, and inside Haysag's workshops, under the dim light of factory lamps, the first prototype of what Germany hoped would be its miracle weapon was quietly taking shape. By early 1944, the first batches of the Panzerfaust 30, its earliest combat-ready version, began arriving at frontline units. Soldiers inspected the strange new weapon with a combination of curiosity and disbelief. It looked like nothing they had seen before. A short metal tube, a wooden firing stock, and at the front, a bulbous warhead so large it seemed comical. Many joked that it resembled a child's drawing of a rocket, but humor faded once they were told what it could do. This weapon, despite its crude appearance, could punch through more armor than any rifle grenade, any hand-thrown charge, or even some early anti-tank guns. Its shaped charge warhead could melt through tank armor using explosive energy, not velocity. And that meant, finally, the infantry had a chance. The Eastern Front was the proving ground. Somewhere in the forests of Ukraine, a small German infantry unit was among the first to receive the Panzerfaust. They were told its effective range was only about 30 meters. Dangerously close, but desperation overpowered fear. When the sound of T-34 engines echoed through the trees, the soldiers braced themselves. The tank broke through the brush, turret scanning, treads crushing the frozen earth. One soldier took aim, a breath. A squeeze of the simple trigger mechanism, a thunderous blast. The warhead streaked forward and slammed into the side of the T-34. A flash, a burst of molten metal, then smoke. The tank stopped. The hatch flew open. The crew, shocked and burned, attempted to escape. It was the first confirmed kill by a Panzerfaust. Word spread quickly. This thing works. Yes, it really destroys tanks. In one shot. Infantry morale shifted overnight. Soldiers who had once felt helpless against Soviet armor suddenly had a weapon that could level the playing field. Commanders reported that even poorly trained troops felt confident knowing they carried a Panzerfaust. Training sessions were comically short, sometimes just 5 minutes. The instructions were almost absurdly simple. Point at tank, judge distance, fire, run. The weapon's simplicity was its genius. Even the most exhausted, inexperienced soldiers could use it safely and effectively. The Soviet tank crews were stunned by the sudden appearance of this new threat. For 2 years, the T-34 had dominated close-range engagements. Now, they were losing tanks to single infantrymen hiding behind fences, in cellars, and in ruined buildings. Crews began welding improvised screens onto their hulls. They added sandbags, wooden planks, spare tracks, anything to soften the blast. But the Panzerfaust's jet of molten metal cared little for improvised protection. The success of the Panzerfaust 30 led to immediate orders for improved versions. Longer range, bigger warheads, more reliability. Production expanded at breakneck speed. HASAG churned out thousands, then tens of thousands every month. By mid-1944, the Panzerfaust was no longer an experimental weapon. It was becoming the backbone of Germany's anti-tank defense. The weapon that had started as a desperate gamble had drawn blood, real blood, in its very first weeks. It proved that infantry could stop armor. And as Germany's situation worsened, the Panzerfaust would only grow deadlier. But success came with a price Germany would soon realize when the weapon spread faster than the training meant to control it. The success of the Panzerfaust 30 changed everything. Once Berlin saw the battle reports, the confirmed tank kills, the panic among Soviet crews, production skyrocketed. But the weapons designers didn't stop there. They pushed forward, creating new versions that were longer ranged, deadlier, and easier to use. The first major upgrade was the Panzerfaust 60. The earlier version's 30-meter range was dangerously short. Many soldiers had to fire at tanks almost point blank, often within the reach of machine gun fire or even the turret's crushing weight. The Panzerfaust 60 doubled the effective range. Now, infantry could engage enemy armor from a safer distance, taking positions in trenches, behind rubble, or inside buildings. Its redesigned firing tube was sturdier, and the simple flip-up sight made aiming more intuitive. This wasn't just a disposable weapon anymore. It was becoming a refined battlefield tool. But 60 meters still wasn't enough. Soviet tank attacks were increasing in scale, often involving dozens of vehicles charging forward together. The German infantry needed something that could punch through armor before the steel beasts reached their lines. Thus came the Panzerfaust 100. It extended the engagement range again and featured an improved propellant system that allowed the warhead to fly straighter, faster, and with more stability. Its warhead was monstrous. Even the heavy frontal armor of the IS-2 became vulnerable, especially at close to medium ranges. In the right hands, the Panzerfaust 100 was a tank's nightmare. By late 1944, Germany's collapse was accelerating, but the engineers continued refining the design, leading to the Panzerfaust 150, arguably the peak of the entire series. It featured higher muzzle velocity, more accurate sights, a more aerodynamic warhead, and a reusable firing tube, unlike previous versions. However, only limited numbers reached frontline units before the war ended. For many historians, the Panzerfaust 150 represents the grim irony of late-war German engineering. Brilliant designs delivered far too late to change the outcome. As the Panzerfaust grew more effective, German infantry tactics evolved with it. Ambushes became the primary method of anti-tank combat. Urban environments, once death traps, became killing zones for tanks. Soldiers hid in basements and attics, firing through small cracks in walls or from behind shattered windows. They waited for tanks to enter intersections, then struck from just meters away. Buildings, rubble, stairwells, every structure in a city turned into a potential launch point. Tanks, designed for open fields, struggled to survive in the hell of collapsing European cities. Soviet crews reported a chilling sensation, moving through ruins where every shadow might hide a Panzerfaust. Every alley, every doorway, every pile of broken bricks, the Panzerfaust became more than a weapon. It became a symbol of last-ditch resistance. In Warsaw, in Budapest, in Königsberg, and soon in Berlin. Its appearance changed the psychology of the battlefield. A single soldier could now influence an engagement normally decided by armored divisions. For German forces, this was empowering. For Soviet tank crews, it was terrifying. And as the Red Army approached the borders of Germany itself, the Panzerfaust, once a desperate experiment, became the backbone of the Reich's final defensive strategy. But the story was about to take a darker turn, because soon, this weapon would be handed not just to trained soldiers, but to civilians, old men and boys who barely understood how to use it. By late 1944, Germany's manpower crisis was reaching catastrophic levels. Entire armies had been shattered on the Eastern Front. Veteran units no longer existed. What remained were fragmented battalions held together by sheer desperation. And yet, Berlin expected its citizens to keep fighting, to stop tanks, to hold streets, to defend every meter, as the propaganda declared. In October 1944, Hitler created the Volkssturm, an improvised militia composed of men aged 16 to 60, students, clerks, retirees, veterans who hadn't held a rifle in 20 years. Their training was often a single afternoon. If they were lucky, they received a rifle. More often, they received a Panzerfaust. To them, this weapon was both a blessing and a curse. It was the only thing capable of killing a tank, but it was also incredibly dangerous if used incorrectly. German propaganda seized upon the Panzerfaust with obsessive enthusiasm. Posters showed heroic tank hunters destroying Soviet armor with ease. Newsreels exaggerated its power, claiming it could wipe out entire columns. The image of a lone soldier standing fearlessly against a T-34 became a central theme. Young boys saw these images and believed they could perform the same feats. Old men were told they could defend Berlin with a single shot. But reality was far harsher. The Panzerfaust was simple, but not idiot-proof. A soldier needed to understand the backblast zone, the firing angle, the minimum safe distance, and the correct way to aim the primitive sight. Yet many Volkssturm members never fired a single practice round. They were handed a weapon, given a 5-minute lecture, and sent to fight Soviet armor. The result was inevitable. Backblast injuries were common. Some blew holes in their own walls. Others tried to fire from inside small rooms, not knowing the explosion behind the tube could kill everyone inside. One tragic report describes 2 teenagers in Berlin who tried to ambush a tank from a cellar. They never saw the tank. The backblast ignited the basement and killed them instantly. Ironically, the Panzerfaust inspired fear not only among Soviet tank crews, but also within the German command. Officers worried about giving such destructive weapons to untrained civilians. Some feared sabotage. Others feared chaos. A few even attempted to restrict distribution, only to be overruled from above. It became painfully clear that Germany's leadership no longer cared about safety. They cared only about slowing the Soviet advance, no matter the human cost. As fighting reached German cities, the Panzerfaust became the weapon of the street. Berlin, Königsberg, Breslau, they all turned into battlegrounds where civilians used the weapon from windows, attics, staircases, and trench-like ruins. The Soviets adapted quickly. Tanks advanced with infantry swarms, machine guns firing into every window, flamethrowers clearing suspected ambush points. But even these tactics couldn't completely eliminate the danger. In the chaos of urban warfare, a single Panzerfaust could decide the fate of an entire armored unit. The human cost of the Panzerfaust was immense. For some, it was a symbol of hope, the only thing standing between their home and destruction. For others, it was a death sentence handed to them by a collapsing regime. And as the Red Army pressed deeper into Germany, the Panzerfaust's role was about to reach its most terrifying potential in the ruins of Berlin. By late 1944, the war in the East had become a war of cities. Streets, alleys, apartment blocks, these became battlegrounds where tanks were forced into the worst terrain imaginable. And the Panzerfaust thrived in this man-made labyrinth. The Warsaw Uprising of 1944 was the first major conflict to reveal the terrifying potential of the Panzerfaust in a dense urban environment. Polish resistance fighters, many armed with captured German weapons, including Panzerfausts, turned narrow streets into tank traps. German and Soviet armored vehicles learned the same harsh reality. In a city, tanks are blind. Every corner hides a killer. Every pile of bricks can conceal a shooter. Every destroyed tram or barricade becomes a firing position. The Panzerfaust transformed from a simple infantry weapon into a psychological terror. Tank crews began advancing slowly, firing into empty buildings, terrified of the one-shot weapon capable of turning them into a burning coffin. In early 1945, the siege of Budapest became one of the bloodiest urban battles of the war. Both German and Hungarian troops used Panzerfausts extensively. The city's twisted streets, ruined apartments, and collapsed bridges created the perfect environment for close-range anti-tank ambushes. Entire Soviet armored columns were stalled not by artillery, but by a handful of Panzerfaust teams firing from basements and attics. Reports from Soviet tank units described Budapest as A city where every building is a fortress and every shadow contains a Panzerfaust. For the first time, Soviet tactical manuals added special chapters instructing tank crews. Never advance without infantry cover, never approach a corner without suppressing fire, and expect an attack at ranges closer than 20 meters. The Panzerfaust had forced a change in doctrine, something extremely rare for a single infantry weapon. As the Red Army crossed into German territory, cities became death traps for both sides. German defenders, now cornered, used every Panzerfaust they could find. In Breslau, children were ordered to carry crates of them across the city. In Königsberg, entire neighborhoods were fortified with hidden firing points. The Panzerfaust became the answer to the question, how do you stop a tank without an army? The Soviets adapted, advancing with infantry in massive formations surrounding each tank. Flamethrowers cleared basements and sewers. Artillery flattened entire blocks to avoid close-range ambushes. But even these brutal tactics couldn't eliminate the threat completely. A single soldier with a Panzerfaust could still cripple a tank worth thousands of man-hours of Soviet labor. And then came Berlin, the ultimate stage for the Panzerfaust. The city was a shattered skeleton of its former self, filled with barricades, rubble mountains, collapsed buildings, and improvised trenches carved from household furniture. This was terrain sculpted for one weapon, the Panzerfaust. German defenders, from hardened veterans to terrified teenagers, positioned themselves throughout the ruins. They fired from sewer openings, from holes punched through basement walls, from the upper floors of bombed buildings, from behind overturned trams and burned-out buses. The Soviets responded with overwhelming force. T-34s advanced with groups of infantry running beside them. Machine guns sprayed every window. Self-propelled guns blasted buildings before approaching them. Yet, even then, the Panzerfaust still struck fear into their hearts. Crews described Berlin as a ghost city full of fire, where tanks could be destroyed by enemies they never saw. By April 1945, the Panzerfaust had become the deadliest anti-tank weapon in Europe, not because it was the most advanced, but because it was everywhere. Every ruined street held dozens. Every Berlin defender carried one. Every Soviet tank commander expected to die to one. In the urban hellscape of the final months, the Panzerfaust became the equalizer, a simple tube of metal that gave the weak a momentary advantage over the unstoppable. The cities of 1944-1945 became graveyards for armored vehicles. The Panzerfaust didn't just change battles, it changed the psychology of urban warfare forever. But after the flames of Berlin died down, a new question emerged. What happened to this weapon after the war? And why did its legacy spread across the world? When the war ended and Berlin fell silent, the world's armies descended upon the ruins of the Third Reich, not to celebrate victory, but to study its weapons. The Panzerfaust was at the top of everyone's list, because despite its cheap materials and crude appearance, it had done something extraordinary. It permanently shifted the balance between infantry and armor. American, British, Soviet, and even French engineers collected thousands of Panzerfausts from abandoned positions and destroyed German depots. At proving grounds across Europe and the United States, they fired the weapon again and again. Every test brought the same conclusion. It was absurdly simple. It was incredibly lethal, and it required almost no training. For the U.S. Army, which relied heavily on the bulky bazooka, the Panzerfaust was a revelation. For the British, who had invested in complex Piat systems, it was almost embarrassing. But the nation that learned the most from the Panzerfaust was the Soviet Union. Soviet engineers had already captured Panzerfausts on the battlefield, using them in emergencies. But after the war, they studied them obsessively. Their conclusion was decisive. infantry needed a lightweight, disposable, shaped charge launcher, permanently. The result was the RPG-2, introduced in the late 1940s. It wasn't a direct copy of the Panzerfaust, but the influence was unmistakable. A simple tube, a powerful heat warhead, ease of manufacture, minimal training requirements. With the RPG-2, the Soviets essentially modernized the Panzerfaust for the early Cold War, and once this foundation was built, the next step was inevitable. In 1961, the world met the RPG-7, a weapon that would soon become the most recognized anti-tank launcher on the planet. Its lineage was clear. The RPG-7 combined the Panzerfaust's simplicity with Soviet engineering, creating a weapon that dominated conflicts across Asia, the Middle East, Africa, and beyond. Where the Panzerfaust was single-use, the RPG-7 became reusable. Where the Panzerfaust had a small sight, the RPG-7 gained optical upgrades. Where the Panzerfaust required close range, the RPG-7 extended that range dramatically. But the heart of the idea, a man with a tube can stop a tank, remained unchanged. It is no exaggeration to say that every modern RPG owes something to the Panzerfaust. The legacy of the German tank fist shaped 70 years of infantry anti-armor doctrine. The Western world wasn't far behind. The US M72 law, the British Energa rifle grenade, Swedish AT-4, and later the German Panzerfaust III, all drew conceptual inspiration from the original Panzerfaust. The idea of a disposable, single-shot launcher became universal. Even the name Panzerfaust reappeared in modern Bundeswehr weapons, a direct homage to the Weibutaier original. So, why did a weapon designed in desperation outlive the nation that created it? Because the Panzerfaust solved a timeless problem with elegant brutality. How does a single infantryman stop a heavily armored vehicle? It answered that question better than any weapon of its era, and its design principles still dominate anti-tank warfare today, from the jungles of Vietnam to the city streets of the Middle East. The Panzerfaust did far more than shape the final months of World War II. It shaped the post-war world, inspiring weapons, doctrines, and revolutions across continents. But its story still wasn't over. There was one final chapter, separating the myths from the realities. The Panzerfaust became a legend long before the last shots of the war were fired. Its simplicity, destructive power, and its role in the final months of World War II allowed myths to grow around it. Some heroic, some terrifying, some simply inaccurate. So now, as we approach the end of our story, it's time to separate fact from fiction. Myth 1. The Panzerfaust could destroy any tank from any angle. Reality. The shaped charge warhead was powerful, but not magical. It struggled against heavily sloped armor, thick frontal plates of IS-2s, and distant shots beyond effective range. It was deadly, but only when used correctly and at the right distance. Myth number 2. You just pointed and fired. Reality. Aiming the Panzerfaust required understanding range estimation, compensating for ballistic drop, choosing the right firing angle, recognizing safe backblast zones. For trained soldiers, it became second nature. For untrained Volkssturm, it was often a disaster. Myth number 3. The Panzerfaust could turn the tide of the war. Reality. No infantry weapon, no matter how effective, could reverse the strategic collapse of 1944-45. The Panzerfaust stopped tanks, yes, but it couldn't replace lost infantry divisions, restore air superiority, rebuild shattered logistics, or halt the overwhelming momentum of the Red Army. It was a powerful weapon in a war largely lost. Myth 4. It was a mass-produced miracle. Reality. It was mass-produced, but with infrequent quality issues, inconsistent propellant charges, fragile firing mechanisms, and occasional misfires. It was brilliant in concept but imperfect in execution. Myth number 5. It was only a German weapon. Reality. After the war, almost every major military power tested, copied, or evolved the Panzerfaust's design. Its DNA flows directly into the RPG-2, RPG-7, M72 Law, AT-4, and dozens of other systems. It became a global idea, not a German one. The Panzerfaust was not a miracle weapon, not a wonder weapon, and not a mythic tank-destroying wand. It was something far more grounded and far more important. A simple, brutally effective tool. A weapon born from necessity. A design that reshaped the relationship between infantry and armor for generations. And now, as we step into the final minutes of our story, we face the ultimate truth. What did the Panzerfaust truly mean? Not to Germany or to the Soviets, but to the world's understanding of war itself. The war is over. The tanks are silent. The smoke that once choked Europe's cities has drifted away, leaving only ruins, memories, and lessons. The Panzerfaust remains in those ruins, scattered throughout the rubble of Berlin, abandoned on staircases, in shattered bunkers, lying next to uniforms of soldiers who never returned home. A weapon built in desperation, used in desperation, and remembered with a mixture of fear, respect, and sorrow. It did not save the Reich. It did not change the outcome of the war, but it changed warfare. Because this simple tube of steel proved one thing with devastating clarity: that the power to destroy a tank no longer belonged only to nations, industries, and armored divisions, but also to a single human being, standing alone in the ruins. In the end, the Panzerfaust wasn't a miracle weapon. It wasn't a wonder weapon. It was a symbol of ingenuity under pressure, of brutality in collapse, and of the tragic, intimate violence of close-range war. Today, echoes of its design live on across the world. Every RPG fired in a distant city, every one-shot launcher carried by modern soldiers, every shaped charge warhead owes something to the crude weapon built in Germany's final hour. And that is the paradox of the Panzerfaust, born in desperation, but destined to shape the future. If you've stayed with us to the very end, thank you. We tell stories like this every week, deep, honest, unfiltered history. If you want more long-form documentaries that cut through the myths and reveal the real past, subscribe. It tells YouTube this story mattered, and it helps us bring the next one to life.